In the American West, a man's land was sacred. His fence was law. But what happens when the law itself doesn't respect those boundaries? Look at that pathetic excuse for a fence. My husband says we can take whatever we want from your kind. They say justice rides slow in the West, but it always arrives. Some lessons are taught with words, others with consequences that echo through generations. If this is your first time here at the Black Rancher, you're about to discover the untold stories of black heroes who shaped the American frontier against impossible odds. Stories history books tried to bury, but truth has a way of rising. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell right now, because this story of dignity, justice, and offense that became legendary will change how you see the Wild West forever. And trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end. The final chapter contains a twist that shocked an entire territory and still resonates today. Now let's ride back to Wyoming Territory, 1882, where a black rancher named Elijah Morgan was about to teach the most powerful family in Clearwater County a lesson they'd never forget. Wyoming Territory, summer 1882. The summer heat shimmered across the rolling grasslands as Elijah Morgan drove the last post into the hard earth. At 45, his broad shoulders and powerful frame showed no sign of the 20 years he'd spent building the Circle M Ranch from nothing. Sweat glistened on his dark skin as he straightened, observing the fence line that now marked the eastern boundary of his property. "That should hold," he muttered to himself, adjusting the worn Stetson that shaded his face. The new fence wasn't fancy, just sturdy cedar posts and 4 strands of barbed wire, but it was necessary. Cattle from the neighboring Triple C Ranch had been accidentally grazing on his land for months now. His ranch hand, a young Mexican man named Miguel, rode up on a Palomino mare. "Senor Morgan, riders coming. 5 men. Sheriff Caldwell is with them." Elijah's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "Get back to the house, Miguel. Tell Samuel to watch from the upstairs window with the rifle." As Miguel rode off, Elijah removed his gloves and waited. Sheriff William Caldwell had made it clear from the day Elijah purchased these 2,000 acres that a black man owning prime grazing land was an offense to his sensibilities. The only thing Caldwell respected less than Elijah's right to the land was the law he was sworn to uphold. The riders appeared over the ridge, dust billowing behind them. Sheriff Caldwell led the group, his silver star catching the sunlight. Beside him rode Charles Crawford, owner of the Triple C and the richest man in the county. The others were Crawford's men, ranch hands with hard eyes and gun-calloused hands. Most surprising was the presence of Victoria Caldwell, the sheriff's wife, perched side-saddle on a chestnut mare. Her silk riding habit and parasol seemed absurdly out of place on the range. "Morgan," Caldwell called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness that always preceded trouble. "What's all this?" Elijah stood his ground. "Just marking what's mine, Sheriff." Victoria Caldwell laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "William, look at this. Fence." She said the word as if it tasted foul. "Is this what passes for craftsmanship among his kind?" Charles Crawford dismounted, approaching the fence line. "You know, Morgan, these lands have been open range since before Wyoming was a territory." "My deed says different," Elijah replied evenly. "And the law says I have the right to fence my property." Sheriff Caldwell spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "Laws can be interpreted, especially out here. Just like property lines can be adjusted," Crawford added with a smirk. Victoria Caldwell fanned herself delicately. "Really, William, must we stand in this heat negotiating with a rancher?" The pause before rancher made it clear she'd substituted a more polite word. Elijah's gaze traveled slowly from face to face. "There's nothing to negotiate. This land is mine, paid for in full. These fences mark my boundaries. Anyone who crosses them without permission is trespassing." Sheriff Caldwell's false smile vanished. "Is that a threat, boy?" "No, sir," Elijah replied calmly. "Just stating facts, like the fact that Judge Harrison in Cheyenne has copies of my deed and boundaries, and the governor's office has records of the harassment I've faced since settling here." Crawford's face darkened. "You went over our heads." "I documented everything," Elijah said. "Every stray cow on my land, every mysterious fire, every threat. I may be just one man, But I'm not without resources. Victoria Caldwell sniffed. How utterly tiresome. William, put an end to this nonsense. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his pistol, but something in Elijah's steady gaze made him hesitate. Another time, perhaps, Crawford interjected smoothly. We have more pressing business in town. He turned to Elijah. But this matter isn't settled, Morgan. As the group prepared to leave, Victoria Caldwell guided her horse directly to the fence. With deliberate contempt, she used her riding crop to snap one of the wires. Oops, she said with a cruel smile. It seems your fence isn't very sturdy after all. Perhaps you should stick to what your people know best. Elijah's expression remained impassive, but his eyes never left hers. Ma'am, he said quietly, I'd advise against crossing my fence again. Some lessons only need teaching once. The threat was subtle but clear. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across Victoria's face before she recovered with a haughty laugh. William, did you hear that? The man threatened me. Sheriff Caldwell's face reddened. You'll regret those words, Morgan. Perhaps, Elijah replied, but not as much as you'll regret what happens if you or yours cross my boundaries again. As the riders departed, Elijah stood watching until they disappeared over the ridge. Then he knelt down and began repairing the wire Victoria had broken. He knew the confrontation was far from over. It had only just begun. 2 weeks passed with an uneasy calm. Elijah rose before dawn each day, working alongside his small crew, Miguel Samuel, a former Buffalo soldier who'd fought beside Elijah in the 10th Cavalry, and 2 Shoshone brothers, James and Thomas Wolf Track. Together they mended fences, tended cattle, and kept vigilant watch. The Circle M wasn't the largest ranch in the territory, but it was one of the most efficient. Elijah had studied animal husbandry, selective breeding, and modern ranching techniques during his years in the cavalry. His cattle were healthier, his calving rate higher, and his methods more sustainable than those of his neighbors. And that, perhaps more than the color of his skin, was what truly threatened men like Charles Crawford. It was Samuel who spotted the riders approaching from the north, a direction that wouldn't take them past the newly reinforced eastern fence line. 6 men, he reported, lowering the brass spyglass. Crawford's foreman Jenkins is leading them. They're driving about 20 head of cattle. Elijah nodded. So that's how they want to play it. Miguel, ride to the ridge and keep watch. James, Thomas, get the horses ready. Samuel, you know what to do. By the time Jenkins and his men reached the northern boundary of the Circle M, Elijah was waiting for them, alone and unarmed. Behind him, the land sloped down toward a meadow where a small creek provided water for his herd. Morgan, Jenkins called out, tipping his hat with mock civility. Got some strays here we're looking to recover. Elijah studied the cattle. Each bore the Triple C brand, but they were suspiciously well grouped for strays. Your cattle seem to have a remarkable sense of direction, Jenkins, always finding their way to my best grazing land. Jenkins shrugged. What can I say? They know quality when they see it. One of the cowboys laughed. Just like the boss says, even dumb animals know whose land this ought to be. Elijah ignored the jibe. Your property ends at Willow Creek. You're half a mile onto my land. Now that's where you're wrong, Jenkins replied, his friendly facade dropping. According to the new survey Sheriff Caldwell had done yesterday, this here is Triple C range. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. Got the documentation right here, signed by the county assessor. Alexander Hayes? Elijah asked, naming the assessor who was Crawford's brother-in-law. Convenient, Jenkins smirked. Law's the law, Morgan, even for your kind. I've got documentation too, Elijah said. Filed with the Territorial Land Office and the federal courts. Well now, that sounds like a dispute that could take months to resolve, Jenkins said with feigned concern. Meanwhile, our cattle need grazing, and this land's just sitting here. Elijah remained motionless. I'm giving you one chance to turn around and take your cattle with you. The cowboy's hands moved closer to their sidearms. Jenkins's smile turned predatory. And what exactly do you think you're going to do about it? There's 6 of us and 1 of you. I'd count again, came Samuel's deep voice from behind them. Jenkins and his men turned to find Samuel, Miguel, and the Wolf Track brothers positioned on the ridge behind them, rifles raised. 4 against 6, Jenkins scoffed. Still bad odds for you. 5, corrected a new voice. A tall figure on horseback emerged from the trees to Elijah's right, Judge Marcus Harrison, from the territorial court in Cheyenne, accompanied by his clerk. Actually, 7, the judge amended. My clerk, Mr. Perkins, is quite handy with a shotgun. The color drained from Jenkins' face. Judge Harrison, what brings you out this way? A disturbing report about county officials falsifying land records, Harrison replied coldly. I decided to investigate personally. He glanced at the document in Jenkins' hand. Is that the fraudulent survey? Jenkins hastily stuffed the paper back in his pocket. Just a misunderstanding, Your Honor. Indeed, Harrison said dryly. One that could result in criminal charges for whoever orchestrated it. His gaze moved to the cattle. I suggest you remove these animals from Mr. Morgan's property immediately. For a moment, Jenkins seemed ready to argue, but the steely look in the judge's eyes changed his mind. With a reluctant nod to his men, they began herding the cattle away. As they departed, Jenkins called back, This isn't over, Morgan. Yes, it is, Judge Harrison replied, unless you'd like to explain to a federal grand jury why you're intimidating a landowner based on fraudulent documents. When the CCC men were gone, Elijah turned to the judge. Your timing is impeccable, Your Honor. Harrison dismounted with a grimace. I was already on my way. Your letter reached me 3 days ago. He surveyed the land with appreciation. Fine property you've built here, Morgan. The territory needs more ranchers with your sense of stewardship. Some would disagree, Elijah said quietly. Some always will, Harrison replied. But this is a nation of laws, not men's prejudices, at least in principle. He handed Elijah a sealed envelope. This is an official ruling confirming your property boundaries as originally recorded. It supersedes any county assessments. Sheriff Caldwell and Mr. Crawford have received copies as well. They won't like that. No, Harrison agreed, but they'll have to abide by it or face serious consequences. He glanced toward the direction Jenkins had disappeared. Though I suspect they may try less direct methods of persuasion. That evening, as Elijah and his men ate dinner, Samuel voiced what they all were thinking. The judge's ruling won't stop them. It'll just make them more careful and more dangerous. Elijah nodded. That's why we need to be ready for whatever comes next. None of them could have predicted just how soon that would be. You're watching The Black Rancher, where we bring you the powerful untold stories of black heroes who helped build the American frontier. If you're enjoying Elijah Morgan's fight for justice and respect, make sure you hit that subscribe button and notification bell right now. Every like and share helps these forgotten stories reach more people who need to hear them. And trust me, what happens next in this story will leave you speechless. Now let's return to Wyoming territory, where the sheriff's wife is about to learn a lesson she'll never forget. Victoria Caldwell was accustomed to getting her way. As the daughter of a wealthy Boston merchant who'd married the most powerful man in Clearwater County, she had spent her entire life watching obstacles disappear at her command. Elijah Morgan and his stubborn fence were an affront to her sense of entitlement. I simply don't understand why we can't remove him, she complained to her husband over breakfast in their lavish home on the edge of town. Charles says that with Morgan's land, the CCC could double its cattle operation. Sheriff Caldwell sipped his coffee. It's not that simple anymore. Harrison's ruling ties our hands legally. Victoria's delicate features hardened. Since when has legality been your primary concern, William? There must be other ways. Caldwell lowered his voice, though their housekeeper had already left the room. Crawford's working on it. Morgan needs to ship his cattle to the railhead next month. Without that income, he won't survive the winter. Arrangements are being made to ensure his herd never reaches the train. Victoria smiled coldly. That's more like it. She rose from the table. I'm going riding with Margaret Crawford this morning. She mentioned showing me a new path along the ridge that offers spectacular views. Stay clear of Morgan's property, Caldwell warned. That man's dangerous. Victoria's laugh was dismissive. A dangerous what? Please, William. He's alone out there with a handful of mongrel workers. What could he possibly do? Later that morning, Victoria and Margaret Crawford rode their expensive thoroughbreds along the high ridge overlooking the valley. Below them stretched the patchwork of ranches that defined Clearwater County, the vast Triple C, the smaller homesteads, and the significant expanse of the Circle M with its distinctive round barn. Charles says that once the Morgan problem is resolved, he's giving William a partnership stake in the Triple C, Margaret mentioned casually. Victoria's eyes gleamed. William mentioned something was in the works. When will it happen? Margaret glanced around, though they were alone on the ridge. The cattle drive. Morgan's entire future depends on getting his herd to the railhead. Charles has arranged for some difficulties along the way. How delicious, Victoria replied. And then what becomes of his precious ranch? Tax auction, most likely. With the right people in the right positions, the property will go for pennies on the dollar. They rode in satisfied silence until they reached a point where the trail descended toward a creek, the same creek that ran through Elijah Morgan's property. Margaret pointed to a cluster of cottonwoods in the distance. That's the best swimming hole in the county, right there on the edge of Morgan's land. Charles and I used to picnic there before that man bought the property. Victoria stared at the inviting spot, then at the fence line visible in the distance. Something rebellious stirred within her. Let's go there now. Margaret hesitated. Charles wouldn't approve. Are we not the wives of the two most powerful men in the county? Victoria asked, raising an eyebrow. Besides, I want to see this fence everyone's talking about up close. Before Margaret could protest further, Victoria urged her horse down the slope toward the creek. When they reached the fence line, Victoria examined it with theatrical disdain. The wire had been reinforced since she'd broken it, and warning signs had been posted at regular intervals. Private property, no trespassing, by order of territorial court. How gauche, she remarked, as if a few signs and some wire could keep out determined people. She dismounted, approaching the fence. The swimming hole lay just beyond, its clear waters gleaming in the midday sun. Victoria, Margaret called nervously, we should turn back. But Victoria was already using her riding crop to press down the top wire while lifting the one below it, creating a gap. With deliberate defiance, she stepped through onto Elijah Morgan's land. See? No lightning strike, no punishment from heaven, she mocked. Come, Margaret, the water looks divine. Reluctantly, Margaret followed. They secured their horses to a tree and spread a small blanket beside the swimming hole. Victoria removed her riding boots and dipped her toes in the cool water, sighing with pleasure. We should claim this spot back, she declared. A little accident to that fence, a fallen tree perhaps, and this becomes neutral territory again. They were so engrossed in their plotting that neither noticed the rider approaching until his shadow fell across them. Afternoon, ladies, Elijah Morgan said quietly. You're trespassing. Victoria scrambled to her feet, her initial shock quickly replaced by indignation. How dare you sneak up on us? This is my land, Elijah replied evenly. You crossed my fence despite clear warnings. Nothing sneaky about riding my property line. Margaret Crawford was already gathering their things, her face pale. We were just leaving, Mr. Morgan. No harm intended. Speak for yourself, Victoria snapped. She faced Elijah with contempt. My husband is the law in this county. I go where I please. Not on my land, Elijah said, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel. Your husband knows the territorial ruling, so does Mr. Crawford. Victoria's laugh was brittle. And you think that matters? Do you know what's planned for your precious cattle drive? The moment the words left her mouth, she realized her mistake. Elijah's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. No, ma'am, I don't. Perhaps you'd care to elaborate. Victoria, Margaret whispered urgently, we need to go. But Victoria was too proud to retreat. You won't have this land much longer, she hissed. Enjoy it while you can. Elijah dismounted slowly. Mrs. Caldwell, there's something you need to understand about this fence. He walked to where they had crossed. It's not just wire and posts. It's a boundary between different worlds. On your side, you might be royalty. On this side, you're just a trespasser. Are you threatening me? Victoria demanded. No, ma'am, I'm educating you. He reached into his saddlebag and removed a small metal box. "Do you know what this is?" Victoria stared at it blankly. "It's a camera, latest model from Eastman in New York. Takes remarkable photographs." He opened it, revealing the lens. "Right now I have a clear image of the sheriff's wife and Mrs. Crawford trespassing on my land against a court order." Imagine how that would look printed in the Cheyenne newspaper. The blood drained from Victoria's face. "You wouldn't dare." "You crossed my fence," Elijah replied simply. "Actions have consequences." Margaret grabbed Victoria's arm. "We're leaving immediately, Mr. Morgan. Please accept our apologies." Victoria shook her off. "I will not apologize to—" "Think carefully," Elijah interrupted. "About your husband's career. About Mr. Crawford's business associates in Cheyenne who value discretion. About what Judge Harrison might think of this deliberate violation of his ruling." For the first time in her privileged life, Victoria Caldwell felt the cold weight of consequences. She had always been protected from them by her father's money, her husband's position, the color of her skin. But the man standing before her, this man she had been taught to look down upon, somehow held power she couldn't dismiss. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "The same thing I've always wanted," Elijah replied. "To be left in peace on my own land, to have my boundaries respected. Nothing more, nothing less." After a long moment, Victoria nodded stiffly. "Fine. You won't see us here again." "One more thing," Elijah said as they prepared to leave. "I'd be interested to hear more about these plans for my cattle drive." Victoria hesitated, torn between pride and self-preservation. Margaret stepped forward. "Rustlers," she said quietly. "In Devil's Canyon the night of the full moon." "Margaret," Victoria gasped. "I have children, Victoria," Margaret replied sharply. "I won't have their future ruined by this pettiness." Elijah nodded his thanks to Margaret, then turned to Victoria. "Remember this feeling, Mrs. Caldwell. It's what happens when you cross boundaries that aren't yours to cross." As the women retreated through the gap in the fence, Elijah called after them, "I'll be watching this fence line, day and night. No one crosses it twice without answering to me." Victoria didn't look back, but his words followed her all the way home. The night of the full moon arrived, casting silver light across the Wyoming plains. Elijah's cattle drive had begun 2 days earlier, 80 head of prime beef cattle heading for the railhead at Laramie, a journey that would take them through Devil's Canyon on this very night. But the herd moving slowly through the canyon wasn't Elijah's. It was a small group of 20 longhorns, borrowed from a Shoshone friend, driven by Miguel and James Wolftrack, disguised as Elijah and Samuel from a distance. The real herd had departed that morning along an alternate route, a longer, more difficult trail that skirted the mountains to the west. Elijah, Samuel, Thomas Wolftrack, and 3 hired hands drove them hard, knowing they needed to reach Laramie before word spread that they had evaded the trap. Back at the ranch, Victoria Caldwell paced nervously on the porch of the main house. She had come alone without her husband's knowledge. When she had told him about the confrontation at the swimming hole, he had exploded in rage, threatening to arrest Elijah on false charges. Only Charles Crawford's cooler head had prevailed, reminding Caldwell that with Judge Harrison watching, they needed to be more careful. But Victoria couldn't shake the memory of Elijah Morgan's steady gaze, the quiet dignity with which he had defended his boundaries. It had awakened something unexpected within her, a question about everything she had been taught to believe. She had heard the rumors in town about the planned ambush at Devil's Canyon. 6 men hired guns from Colorado, paid to ensure Elijah Morgan's cattle never reached the railhead. The plan was to steal the herd and eliminate any witnesses. Men would die tonight, men including the ranch hands she had dismissed as mongrels, perhaps Elijah Morgan himself. And for what? Land, pride, the color line she had been taught never to cross. When a rider approached from the direction of town, Victoria stepped back into the shadows. To her surprise, it was her husband, accompanied by 2 deputies. "Search the house," Sheriff Caldwell ordered. "Find her." Victoria watched in silence as they ransacked Elijah's home. When they emerged empty-handed, Caldwell cursed. "She has to be here. The stable boy said he saw her riding this way." "Maybe she went to warn Morgan about the canyon," one deputy suggested. Caldwell's face darkened. If she interferes with Crawford's plan— He didn't finish the thought. "Burn it," he ordered suddenly. "Burn it all down. House, barn, everything. Let's see how mighty Morgan feels when he returns to ashes." Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. This was madness, criminal, vindictive madness. As the men gathered lamp oil from their saddlebags, Victoria slipped away to where she had hitched her horse. There was only one choice now. She had to reach Devil's Canyon before it was too late. She rode hard through the moonlight, taking shortcuts she remembered from childhood explorations. When she heard gunfire echoing from the canyon ahead, she pushed her horse to its limits. The scene that greeted her was chaos. The hired guns had sprung their ambush, but instead of finding Elijah and his valuable herd, they had encountered Miguel and James with the decoy cattle. A firefight had ensued. Miguel was pinned down behind a boulder, wounded but still returning fire. James was nowhere to be seen. Without thinking, Victoria charged into the fray, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Federal marshals coming! Flee while you can!" Her sudden appearance, combined with the warning, created momentary confusion. Two of the hired guns immediately mounted up and fled. The others hesitated, trying to assess this new threat. "Mrs. Caldwell?" one of them called in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Before she could answer, a shot rang out from the ridge above, dropping the man from his saddle. James Wolftrack had positioned himself as a sniper. "Get down!" Miguel shouted to Victoria. She obeyed, diving from her horse as bullets whizzed overhead. What followed was a blur of violence and fear, unlike anything Victoria had ever experienced. When it ended, 3 of the hired guns were dead, 1 was wounded and captured, and 2 had escaped. Miguel's arm was bleeding badly from a bullet wound. James limped down from his position, a crimson stain spreading across his trouser leg, and Victoria Caldwell, wife of the sheriff and daughter of privilege, was helping tend their wounds with strips torn from her expensive riding skirt. "Why?" Miguel asked as she bandaged his arm. "Why did you come?" Victoria couldn't fully answer the question for herself, let alone for him. "They're burning the ranch," she said instead. "My husband and his deputies. By now it's probably gone." James and Miguel exchanged grim looks. "We need to get back," James said. "Fast." "First, tie him up." Miguel nodded toward their prisoner. "He's our proof of what happened here." As they prepared to leave, Victoria faced a choice: return to town and the life she had always known, or ride with these men to confront her husband and whatever consequences awaited. In that moment, standing in moonlight stained with blood, she realized some fences once crossed could never be uncrossed again. Dawn broke over the Circle M ranch, revealing not ashes, but an armed standoff. Sheriff Caldwell and his deputies had been foiled in their arson attempt by the arrival of Judge Harrison and 6 federal marshals who had come to the ranch seeking Victoria. Now they all watched in stunned silence as 4 riders approached from the east. Victoria, Miguel, James, and their prisoner. Sheriff Caldwell's face contorted with rage and disbelief as his wife dismounted beside Judge Harrison rather than coming to stand by him. "Victoria," he sputtered. "What is the meaning of this? These men kidnapped you." "These men saved me," she corrected coldly, "from becoming an accessory to the crimes you and Charles Crawford planned." Harrison stepped forward. "Serious accusations, Mrs. Caldwell. Do you have proof?" Victoria nodded toward their prisoner. "This man was hired to ambush Elijah Morgan's cattle drive. He can testify who paid him." The prisoner, sensing opportunity, nodded vigorously. "Crawford paid us. Sheriff knew all about it. Got the money ready himself." "Liar!" Caldwell shouted, drawing his pistol. The federal marshals immediately aimed their weapons at him. "Lower your weapon, Sheriff," Harrison ordered. "You're outnumbered and outmaneuvered." Victoria faced her husband. "They were going to burn everything, Your Honor. I heard him give the order myself." "She's confused," Caldwell protested. "We came here looking for her, worried about her safety." "With lamp oil in your saddlebags?" Harrison asked pointedly. He turned to his marshals. "Arrest him and his deputies. Charges include conspiracy to commit arson, attempted murder, and abuse of office." As they were being handcuffed, Victoria approached her husband. "There's one more thing you should know," she said quietly. "Elijah Morgan and the main herd are already halfway to Laramie by the Western Trail. They'll reach the railhead by tomorrow night." The look of stunned defeat on Caldwell's face was answer enough. 3 days later, Elijah Morgan returned to find his ranch intact and under the protection of federal marshals. Charles Crawford had fled the territory, but federal warrants ensured he wouldn't get far. Sheriff Caldwell and his deputies awaited trial in Cheyenne, and Victoria Caldwell sat alone on the porch of the town's small hotel, her social standing evaporated, her future uncertain. When Elijah approached her, she stiffened, expecting recrimination. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said simply, "I understand I owe you my thanks." She shook her head. "You owe me nothing, Mr. Morgan. I merely did what any decent person should have done far sooner." "Nevertheless," he replied, "you crossed a different kind of fence that night, a harder one to breach than wire and cedar posts." Victoria met his gaze directly, without the contempt that had once filled her eyes. "Yes, and like you said, some lessons only need teaching once." Elijah nodded. "Judge Harrison tells me you've agreed to testify against your husband and Crawford. Yes, it's the right thing to do." After a moment's hesitation, Elijah said, "The Circle M could use someone to keep the books, someone who understands numbers and can write the kind of letters that make territorial officials take notice." Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "Are you offering me employment, Mr. Morgan?" "I'm offering you a chance to rebuild," he replied. "Same as someone once offered me." "Why would you do that? After everything?" "Because," Elijah said simply, "fences aren't just for keeping people out. Sometimes they're for defining what we stand for, the boundaries of our character." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. "I can't promise it will be easy," he warned. "People will talk." Victoria straightened her shoulders. "Let them. I've learned there are worse things than gossip, Mr. Morgan, like living on the wrong side of justice." 1 month later, as summer faded toward autumn, Elijah Morgan rode the boundaries of his property, checking his fence line. The Circle M was thriving. The cattle sale had brought record prices, and with Crawford's influence removed, other ranchers were now willing to do business with him. Victoria had proved herself an excellent bookkeeper and was slowly earning the respect of Elijah's crew through hard work and a humility none had expected from her. As he crested a rise overlooking the swimming hole, Elijah noticed something new along his fence, small wooden signs placed every 100 yards, facing outward toward the neighboring properties. He rode closer to read one. "This fence stands for justice, not division. Respect it and you'll be respected in return." In smaller letters beneath, someone had added, "Some lessons only need teaching once." Elijah smiled. Victoria's handiwork, no doubt. The woman understood boundaries now, and the power of the fences we choose to cross or respect. And that, my friends, is how Elijah Morgan's fence became legendary in Wyoming territory, not just as a boundary between properties, but as a line between right and wrong that transformed lives on both sides. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. These powerful Black stories from our American past deserve to be told. Remember, here at the Black Rancher, we're uncovering history one fence post at a time, revealing the courage, dignity, and wisdom of those who came before us. Thank you for riding with me today. Until next time, respect your boundaries and honor your word. Those are fences that will never fail you.